Graham, you contributed to the most recent issue of Primer on the Doctrine of Sin. And really, we handed you a pile of books about sin and asked you to go away and reflect on them. It'd be great just to hear what was the big thing that struck you about those books.
Well, lots of things struck me. What a complex topic it is, what a foundational topic it is. I think for me there were two particular lessons. One was seeing how people understood we can sin in different ways. It wasn't true of all the authors, and they came at it from different angles and had different reflections on it. But there was often an understanding that we could sin by a kind of prideful, overreaching, transgressing God's law. But also a lot of people reflected on our underachieving, how we fell short of what God called us to in living. So two very broad, different ways of sinning. The other thing that struck me was people discussed what the essence of the article was. Is there a kind of a core to sin, an essence to sin? And again, they came at it from different angles and had slightly different takes, but it often revolved around the issue of belief. What do you fundamentally believe? And in sin, we are believing untruth. I don't think any of the authors referenced it, but they could have referenced Francis Turretin's idea of false faith. That in sinning you're believing something untrue about God.
Okay, let's pull this apart a little bit. The first one was this idea that you can sin either kind of actively or passively, kind of aggressively or in a more passive way. Just fill out a little bit more for us. Why is that a helpful way to think about it pastorally? How do you see that?
Yeah, thank you. It's I think we're more familiar with sin as breaking God's law in an active sense, transgressing. And that becomes more obvious. You know, you do something and you can point at it and say, that's sin, stop it. And some pastoral work, of course, involves dealing with exactly that. I think the other category is kind of like the slightly missing one that is really helpful pastorally, where people are falling short of what God would call them to. So take marriage. You could wreck your marriage through active disobedience, like looking at pornography or pursuing a relationship you shouldn't. But you could also destroy your marriage through just neglecting your wife. Now, it's still disobeying God's law because God tells you to love your wife. But it's harder to spot it straight off because there isn't so much of a line you cross. And so in all sorts of pastoral settings, having those two areas in mind, and both calling people to obedience to what God says in the sense of not overstepping, but also calling them up to what God says and what God's call on them in a situation is, I found very helpful.
So it's kind of related to confessing both the sins which we've committed and the good that we haven't done.
Yeah, that's right. It is sins of commission and omission, but looking at it in more depth, just filled out that omission category in a much more robust way.
Thank you. What then about this question of what sin boils down to? You've mentioned unbelief or false faith. I guess most people would say sin is the bad things we do. Why is it helpful to push beyond that and see an issue of faith there?
Because we're always driven by what we believe and what we long for and love. And all of that's kind of wrapped together in what the Bible talks about as the heart. And so asking why do we sin is paramount in helping people in fighting sin and understanding ourselves and so on. And so asking what I believe in certain settings, not just intellectually, but what I really long for and think is really true about the world. So when Adam and Eve were faced with the fruit, if you ask them at that moment that Eve reached out and took the fruit, what do you really think was true about the world there? She thought God wasn't for her. She thought God was probably lying. She thought this would give her something. She thought she'd go up in the world. She was wrong on all of those. And we're wrong in similar ways in all the ways we sin.
And helping other people see that, helping ourselves see that in our own hearts is just going to help us understand ourselves better, the decisions that we make, why we sin, and to break some of those habits.
Yeah, pastorally that's really helpful. You've got to be careful not to over-intellectualize it. And there is, of course, an issue just of self-control, And when Paul says flee sexual immorality, he doesn't mean just sit and reflect on what you believe. He means get away from it. So it's not only this, but I do think asking that question about what we're believing and what we're thinking is true about the world in sin really helps us change from the inside out, rather than just holding back our behaviour.
So in general, how do you think some of those ideas shape how we teach about sin? We do sometimes, I guess, teach it in a fairly flat way. We have our kind of stock illustrations or metaphors. Sin is rebellion, it's idolatry. How does what you've been reflecting on help us be a bit more multicoloured?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, just being aware of the variety of explanation, illustration, metaphor, and so on in Scripture. You're right, I think we do tend to fall back to a couple of stock ones. So not so much in the article, but just in my reading generally, there is sin as idolatry, there is sin as rebellion, there's sin as transgression of law, but there's sin as losing your way, sin as going astray, sin as foolishness, sin as becoming unclean, sin as not listening, having a hard heart, sin as pride, and so on and so on. And that's not all of them. And just having a richer picture ourselves, I think, will mean we won't fall so much into our stock standard illustrations. But also in preaching, of course, if we're doing exegetical preaching, we want to see what this passage says about sin and being alert to its metaphors, explanations, feel and tone, rather than seeing the word sin and just sort of filling in the blank, as it were. And for example, Ephesians 4 talks about people being darkened in their understanding, being separated from the life that is in God. So you've got sin as being dead. You've got ignorance because of hard hearts. That's just in one verse, 4 phrases. Well, that's a very rich picture there. And my worry is in preaching we'll just make that equal sin. Whereas actually there's a lot to tease out. So being alert to look for that kind of nuance and feel in each passage we're preaching.
Helpful, thank you. I think in your church you're a pastor of, you've just finished preaching a sermon series, a topical series on sin, which would be really helpful just to try and think practically how we rub this in to church life. First of all though, it'd be great just to hear why topical series, how often you do those, what's the thinking behind that?
Yeah, I guess I do 2 sorts of topical preaching. One will be a one-off sermon on a topic, sometimes driven by something in the news. I did one a little while ago on the migrant crisis, for example. Sometimes it'll be a one-off on some aspect of Christian living or Christian topic. I guess I'll maybe do 1 or 2 of those a year. Then the second would be, as you've referred to, a whole series that's a topical series, with this case a topic of sin, and that would maybe be 6, 7, 8, whatever sermons on a topic, and I'd do those maybe once every other year or something like that.
Okay, and this particular series on sin, just fill in for us, what did that look like? How many weeks did you say it was?
It was 8 weeks, this one.
8 weeks. Topics, passages?
Yeah, it was quite hard to divide it up, and I think if I did it again starting next week, I'd do it differently. We began in Genesis 3, surprise, surprise, looking particularly on the sin as unbelief type idea. We did some more in Genesis 1 to 3 with the sinning 2 different ways, the falling short as well as overstepping, and that got traced out through the rest of Scripture. We did the start of Ephesians 2 on what it means to be dead in sin, Mark 7 on the heart as the source of sin, 2 Timothy 3 looking at sin as a kind of inverted love, loving self rather than loving God and others, James 1 on nature of temptation and deception, Jeremiah 2 on sin as idolatry, and if I've counted them up rightly, I think there's 1 left, which would be some material from Romans on sin as taking glory from God and how God provides a solution to sin in re-establishing his lordship and glory.
Okay, that sounds well, it sounds great. I can imagine if I was in the congregation, and I was told, we're going to spend 8 weeks thinking about sin,
Yeah.
I'd have hung my head and thought, man, this is going to be negative.
Yeah.
Was it? How did it go?
Yeah, overall it went really well. That was a challenge. I did say to people at some points, I'm telling you new things you ought to now feel guilty about that you hadn't realised before. And so I tried to address that issue of negativity head on sometimes. Even that ended up having a positive in that we try to think about both the structure of the sermons and the services themselves quite carefully. So we'd never finish just with, well, that's bad, isn't it? We'd finish with, well, what does that make us appreciate about the gospel? And quite often the sermon will be earlier in the service, and then we'd have longer reflecting in reading and song and prayer on how Jesus is the answer to this. So in that sense, it wasn't negative. It also wasn't negative in the sense I think people felt like taking the lid off sin and having a look at it more and how it works and so on gave them more sort of understanding. And one of the outcomes we wanted was I can fight sin better. I want to appreciate the gospel more, and I want to be better equipped in fighting sin. I think people felt that. So it had some challenges, but overall it went very well.
Thank you.